Hey everyone, hope everyone's doing well and staying safe these days. I do have another motherboard review here. This is actually the X670E actually from MSI, carbon motherboard. And of course I've always been a big fan of the carbon class motherboards here. I don't really understand what the E is actually for. Back then I think the E actually usually stands for like an extended form factor of the motherboard, but actually taking a look at pictures and whatnot, as you can actually see here, this is actually not an extended motherboard at all, so it's actually basically your regular mid ATX form factor motherboard. So definitely a very pricey motherboard actually too. I've actually seen this going for around $300 to $400, even a little bit more. So there've actually been a lot of chit chat online about newest AMD Ryzen motherboards, X670 in particular, that have actually been quite pricey compared to its previous generations of chipset motherboards, such as the X370, 470, 570, basically so forth right there. Let me know if I missed one. I think that's all of them, besides the B classes and everything else. So let's go ahead and take a look what features it actually has and everything else. Quick BIOS overview, installation, and anything else we can actually find on this motherboard. So let's get to it. Just initial looks of the box itself, I can actually see this box really took a bit of a beating on a couple of the corners. Not a big deal, it's really inside what counts, but you know, the box actually looks like it's been a return product, and it's kind of hard to tell since most MSI motherboards actually don't have any seals and whatnot, which is alright, not a big deal. But so let's go ahead and open this up. Another thing I want to point out as well too, while we're talking about physical aspects of this box, this package has some weight to it. This motherboard definitely has a lot of heat sinks and metal and everything else on it, so it definitely does have a weight to it. This motherboard itself probably weighs a good 5 pounds, I would say. 4 to 5 pounds, just you know, everything inside of it. Let's go ahead and take a look at the back of the box here, just initial looks here. Actually see here a good picture, all the little details and features it actually has, and a little picture of the backplate I/O ports over here. A lot of USB ports you can actually see, including 2 Type-C USB-C ports there as well too. And some other details I just mentioned here as well. You can actually see one of those dents I was talking about earlier, and some other details here as well. So let's go ahead and get this box opened up, take a look at the motherboard. I'm assuming everything should be okay. And here we can see, looks like it's a box within a box, as MSI usually does. They have this little box over here, which probably has the Wi-Fi antenna and other stuff inside of it as well too. I'll go ahead and take a look at that in a moment. Let's go ahead and lift this out. And yes, this motherboard definitely has quite a bit of weight, and the biggest chunk of weight inside this entire box itself. And over here we can actually see a couple of things here. Looks like 2 SATA cables here. Looks like your RGB cables here. Look at 4-pin and a 4-pin extender actually. Another little cable here. This one actually looks like a 3-pin RGB cable. Some M2 screws here, right over here. Looks like there might be like 2 of them in there. This one looks like the little USB port, USB thumb drive that actually has drivers and whatnot in here. If I recall, I believe these are 16 gigabyte basically thumb drives here, but I believe last time I actually had my hands on one, it was actually a USB 2, so if you actually plan to repurpose this for something else, just bear in mind it's a bit of a slower one. Still, you can always use it as a Windows 10 installation, Windows 11, whatnot, and you know, you get Windows, your OS installed fairly quickly. A couple of little stickers here for cables and whatnot, if you actually want to just label them. And just some other little manuals here, something to do with Europe, and a quick installation guide as well too. Here it looks like we have another M2 screw as well. So let's go ahead and toss this back in here. And just want to take a quick look here. Very likely it's just going to be the Wi-Fi antennas. And it looks like it is. We can actually see here the base. 2 little screws to go in the back of the motherboard. Here's the board itself with its protective anti-static bag. I'm going to go ahead and open this up. I actually really like to repurpose these bags, so I don't like to rip them and whatnot. I'm very careful, usually with the little tape here, try not to yank it open and whatnot. Can't help it, right? Sometimes the bag gets a little bit warped. It's no big deal. And basically here we are. Immediately you can see how tough this motherboard actually looks. Definitely not the high tier motherboards, because there's those godlike motherboards from MSI that probably cost at least $600 or $700 that I've actually seen. Basically all covered with heat sinks and whatnot. This one definitely does have its fair share, as you can see here. Chipset under here, protecting some M2 slots, including your Generation 5 and whatnot. There's your PCI Express slot. I'll go ahead and do a quick overview of the entire motherboard in just a moment. And of course, there's your your AM5 socket for your Ryzen CPUs with a little protective cover, since obviously now we are now doing a pinless approach, a CPU pinless approach on the Ryzen processors these days, which something Intel's been doing for some time. AMD hasn't jumped on that wagon just until recently. There are advantages and disadvantages to that. I mean, obviously you can bend your CPU, the pins on the CPU, which will definitely be a big issue. But considering the cost of this particular motherboard right now, the suggested price of it, I'd actually be more concerned with bending the pins on the motherboard itself, which is a real disaster, because now the entire unit has basic issues over here. But obviously there's a little protective plastic and of course some careful installations that you have to follow in order to avoid that unfortunate event right there. Let's go ahead and take a look at the motherboard. This particular section of motherboards these days just keep getting bigger and bigger. The back I/O plate is now firmly attached usually to the motherboard, which I find very convenient and also just much better in terms of just looks right here. It looks very professional, very easy to install, not having to worry about whether you forgot to put the plate on it or not, or it giving you an issue to be physically installed on the case that you have. So let's go ahead and take a look back here. Looks like we have some CMOS buttons over here, basically to reset the CMOS and whatnot, and actually go ahead and update the BIOS without a CPU or even memory installed, which is actually really useful here. This particular option has been a feature for many motherboards over a number of generations, fairly recent, and something I've actually not used myself, but you actually do have the option here as well. Just right next to it, we do have a DisplayPort and an HDMI connection here. If you're planning to use a Ryzen CPU with built-in video graphics and whatnot, you'll be using these connections right over here. Obviously, bear in mind you can be using a CPU with built-in onboard graphics, onboard GPU, and still use a dedicated video card on your PCI Express slot. Next to that, it looks like we have a number of USB ports. Looks like 3 plus another 4, and another one here. Looks like a total of 8 USB 3 ports over here. Actually, these two look like they're USB 2, and 6 USB 3 ports as well here. An additional 2 USB Type-C ports, so a total of 10 actually. Very interesting and very amazing to actually see on these particular motherboards. I have noticed as well too that MSI have done away with the PS2 ports, so there's usually 2 over here. Something they actually continued doing through many generations of AM4 motherboards, and eventually actually just got rid of it here, which would make it a very interesting challenge to install Windows 7 on these motherboards if someone is daring enough to give that a shot. So just look out. There might be a future video based on that. Right next to that, we actually do have this 2.5 gigabit LAN connection, which is obviously becoming the standard these days. Very useful if you plan to use this motherboard not on Wi-Fi and using it regular on cable. Personally, I actually use many desktop motherboards and computers all using Ethernet cable, not really on Wi-Fi with the exception of 1 or possibly 2, which is probably going to be my media PC in my living room. Speaking of Wi-Fi, we do have those 2 connections here for the antenna in that smaller box that I just demonstrated earlier. And a little bit hard to see a little bit here, but we do have our audio connections. We have one optical out right over here. Here, of course, is your stereo connection, and other connections here, very useful for surround sound. I've actually seen this on particular MSI motherboards where it basically just says audio boost, or somewhere around here it's scribbled something with audio, which is pretty interesting. And I just basically guess that's probably where the chipset or the the chip basically handling the audio is actually hiding. So just something to know there. So I'll do a quick overview of the connections down here on the bottom of the motherboard. Looks like we do have our audio onboard connection for front panel connection. If you actually do want to connect a headphone jack and microphone jack on the front of the computer on your case, this is the connection to use right over here. Right over here we do have a 4-pin RGB connection, very useful here as well too, if you actually want to go ahead and connect that for the lights you actually have available. Moving further to the right over here, there's a number of pretty interesting looking pins over here that I really barely see on other motherboards, and the actual MSI manual really doesn't mention too much details about it. I am aware that one of these is basically a thermal sensor, and one of them is the chassis intrusion little pin connection here, which isn't used too much, but you know, it's definitely available. So I want to look into that a little deeper if you're really curious about some of these pins, but you know, the manual itself doesn't mention too much about it. So you definitely do have the option to, you know, connect something here if you do have that particular product. Moving on a little bit more to the right, we do have two dual 4-pin fan connections, basically chassis fan use right here. So this motherboard does have its pretty good share of fans, which are very useful, and I'll go over all those in just a moment. Over here further to the right, looks like we do have two dual regular USB 2.0 connections for front panel use. Now, not many people really use USB 2 anymore, but I do know there's some components out there, such as a PSU from Corsair, that does have a little connection here, so you can actually keep an eye on voltage and other, basically live specs going on your product, that you can actually connect one of those right over here and be able to monitor everything correctly. So just something to keep in mind. But of course, if you do have some front panel to USB 2.0 connections, feel free to connect one right there. And speaking of front panel, we do have a standard USB 3 front panel connection right over here. We do have another one on the other side, and I'll get to that in just a moment. You can actually see them right here. Right over here, it looks like this is basically a LED switch of some sorts. I want to look into that a little bit deeper as well too. And over here, we do have your front panel connections here for reset, power button, hard drive, LED lighter, and all those other connections here that are pretty much standard for your use on front panel stuff. Up here, we also have a 4-pin speaker connection as well too. And just to the right, right over here underneath my finger, is a 3-pin RGB connection as well. So a number of RGB connections that's becoming more popular these days are available in this particular motherboard, as well as many others. So definitely a lot of little pins right over here that you'll feel free to actually use if needs be. Moving on to the side here, we have an additional 4-pin fan connection right over here. Very useful. Quite a few number of fan connections on this motherboard, and as well as an additional USB 3 front panel connection right over here. Just to the right of that, we have 6 SATA connections. I'm actually really surprised that these motherboards still are using more and more, well, actually the same number of 6 SATA connections here. Now, there were the motherboards previous on generations of motherboards for Ryzen that did have 8, but 6 is still a pretty decent number. So you had to have 6 available SATA connections. And I say that because obviously a lot of computers these days don't have any more optical drives, which would be less SATA connections there, as well as also using less SATA hard drives as well, unless of course you are connecting the mechanical, which I personally use myself. Most connections are actually using the NVMe M2 slots, and I'll go over those in just a moment. But still, you know, you do have 6 available here. Just a little bit of a surprise to me personally. A little bit further to the right, we do have this USB 3 Type-C connection here. I was actually hoping to see 2 of these, but you know, definitely do have the connection here available for front panel use. Very useful right over here. Goes pretty well with your USB 3.0 front panel connections as well. Moving along here further to the right, we do have your standard 24-pin connection for your PSU. This is something that really hasn't changed over the years and is obviously still available. Previously, we did have computers and motherboards available with 20 pins, 20 pin right over here, but now it's actually still a standard 24 pin for, I would say, at least 15 years and moving. Just behind here on the connections here, we do have the 4 memory slots, DIMM slots right over here for DDR5 use, and I'll go over that again in just a moment. Moving along here, looks like we have another 3-pin RGB connection in this little area. You can actually see that. Something I'm very excited to actually mention on this motherboard is basically this little indicator right over here. And this actually can be used for a couple of things. Usually when turning the computer on, it can actually tell you exactly what kind of issue you might be having. If your computer is not posting, it could give you a particular error message, and you can actually look that up on the motherboard as well. At least that's exactly what I used to see prior on the MSI motherboards, and I'm pretty sure this one is no different. Once your motherboard's actually posted and booted up normally, you will probably just see a standard CPU temperature jumping between 20, 30, 40, and who knows what other degrees Celsius available as well. Moving along to the top portion of the motherboard here, we can see there's an additional 4-pin, actually, I'm sorry, it looks like 4-pin connections here for fan use. Now, 2 of these or 1 of these is probably for chassis use, but you can feel free to use them for anything you want. One of them is a dedicated CPU fan. One of them appears to be a dedicated pump fan as well too. So you definitely want to use those for those particular purposes, particularly the CPU fan, because otherwise if you connect it to another fan, you're going to see your fans maxing out as the computer is thinking that the CPU fan has failed or was not connected, and you're basically heading for an overheating situation here. So just something to keep in mind once you connect your fans. You don't want to connect it to the wrong connection here and have an issue with that. Over here, looks like we do have a little bit of a heatsink, pretty large, and actually connected to the large heatsink that's basically protecting the back connections right there on the rear of the computer and motherboard. Moving along here, looks like we have dual 8-pin CPU power connections here. This isn't surprising since Ryzen, the new generation of Ryzen CPUs actually go well beyond 100 watts of CPU power. One's hitting around 105, I believe, and there are even some hitting 170. That's actually just for standard use. So if you actually wanted to overclock, probably need to use both of these, and it does give you a little bit of headway if you plan to overclock your CPU quite a bit, being able to feed it some more wattage right over here and more power with these dual 8-pin CPU connections right over there. There, of course, again, are your memory DIMM slots. I'm actually going to go ahead and move the ones that I plan to use here and leave the little latches here opened up. Feel free to go ahead and use the correct ones for dual channel use. If you actually do put the memory in the wrong slots, it'll still work, but not be ideal or optimal for dual channel use. So obviously I'm going to go ahead and open these 2 here for dual channel use. So basically there are your DDR5 DIMM slots, and of course very important here is your AM5 socket for your AM5 Ryzen CPU. Again, as I mentioned earlier, this is a pinless CPU. All the pins are actually on the motherboard, and therefore it does have this protective plastic right over here. If you ever do plan to put this motherboard away, definitely recommend to go ahead and put that plastic on, so don't lose this. Very useful to actually have. And usually people like to remove this before installation. If you put it after installation, once you actually push the latch down and everything, this piece of plastic will actually just pop off with pressure from the CPU pushing it off itself. So completely your call how you want to go ahead and approach that. I've seen some people actually do it that way with Intel CPUs, so it should be pretty much no different in terms of installation. Taking a look at the slots itself, we do have a PCI Express. This should be Generation 5 PCI Express X16 slot right over here. And below looks like we have another dedicated PCI Express slot. May not be Generation 5, I gotta look into that, for video cards, and another one down here as well too, which even though it does have the long slot, I think it just has pins for X8 speeds and whatnot. Just below, underneath all these heat sinks, we probably have the M2 NVMe slots. Looks like we have the main one right over here, which is your Gen 5. And down here looks like there's probably room enough for 2 of them. I'm going to probably say that either Gen 5 or Gen 4, something to look into as well. These heat sinks are actually here basically just to avoid for the drive to actually get overheated and start throttling back, which can be an issue for performance and whatnot. I've personally not run into that issue before, and there's only 2 exceptions to that. One was if I'm actually migrating a large amount of data over from one drive to another. Considering how fast these things are, usually before the drive starts getting overheated or getting a little too warm, your transfer is pretty much complete. I've actually have a video transferring over 100 gigabytes of data in less than 1 minute. So that's a pretty good feat right there. Second thing as well too is when you're actually using this video editing and you're basically where your video is being saved to is one of these drives, you actually just might run into an error message in whatever video software you used. I did actually have run into that issue before, so just something to keep in mind there. Many different factors. These are really good heat sinks. Some people prefer to actually use their own heat sinks or built-in heat sink that the drive actually might come with. So feel free to actually take these covers actually off and just leave them off and just use it on the heatsink you actually have. So that is pretty much it for a quick overview of the motherboard itself in terms of just looking at it in the physical way here. But let's go ahead and get this installed. Toss the CPU on, install some memory chips, a video card, connect some drives, and boot it up. Take a quick look at the BIOS. Possibly see if there's an update to the firmware itself, and I'll go ahead and install that if there is. And just basically take a look also what kind of LED RGB colors actually might be on this motherboard as well too. Really looking forward to actually seeing how this thing looks. I have actually read and heard that a number of AM5 motherboards have been taking a little bit longer to boot up. Something I've actually noticed in early generation Ryzen motherboards dating back to the X670E chipset days, and I have noticed that some BIOS firmware updates really did resolve that quite a bit. So, basically just a little bit of a waiting game to some degree, but we'll go ahead and see how this basically turns out. I know the initial boot up is definitely going to take quite some time, 30 or 40 seconds I've actually seen, and obviously, I'm sure we're going to be seeing some interesting numbers and whatnot and characters on this display right up here. Let's go ahead and get this going. Alright everyone, our system is booted up and running. Hope everyone enjoyed that little short build process. Did actually want to go ahead and make a quick note on one little thing. You may have actually noticed that I did relocate one of the rear back plates, or the blanks as we occasionally call them, just to make way for the video card. And that was actually something I haven't done in previous motherboard reviews. So it actually looks like on this particular motherboard, the main PCI Express slot appears to be physically one slot lower than many other motherboard counterparts from other brands that I've actually done reviews on. So I actually had to just relocate the blank just to make room for the video card to actually go in, which obviously is no big deal whatsoever. But I actually did just want to go ahead and just point that out, since I actually got a little comment about it in one of my YouTube motherboard reviews, another one. And basically I was being asked if I could basically specify whether or not the video card will possibly block access to SATA ports. And on that particular motherboard, that actually doesn't appear like it probably would. On this one, just want to note, since the video card is now one slot lower, so it's about maybe almost a little over ½ an inch or so, this actually will somewhat cover the SATA ports a little bit. So if you're going to be using a video card that's definitely bigger in length than the one I actually am using here as a demonstration, you may actually have a little bit of an issue accessing those SATA ports without actually removing the video card. So just something to keep in mind there. Obviously, this usually is not really a big deal for most computer builders, but it's definitely so I just want to actually go ahead and make a note there, in case anyone was actually wondering. Now, there is actually two SATA ports on the bottom part of the motherboard, but those obviously may just be a little, maybe just preferably not being used, since the SATA port cables will actually be sticking out as opposed to just being tucked away on the side. So just want to make that quick note there. If everyone enjoyed this video so far, go ahead and shoot that like and subscribe button. Just go ahead and support the channel here. Definitely have more reviews and other little notation videos up and coming very soon. So hope everyone's enjoying so far. One real cool thing about actually booting up this particular computer is that little LED display that I actually had up there, and you probably see those two little numbers, or alphanumeric numbers appear there. And those actually, usually when your computer's online like it is now, does actually tell you what the basically the CPU temperature is. And I'm not really sure if that can actually be manipulated anyway. I'm sure there's some software out there that can go ahead and change that to actually show something else if you'd like. But while the machine is actually booting up and posting, you actually see those little numbers and letters changing, because basically it's telling you the current status of the motherboard as it's trying to post, whether there's an issue with CPU, memory, video card, or anything else related to that might be causing the system not to boot up correctly. So if that actually happens and it gets stuck somewhere, you also do see those little LED notifications on the side, but the number will also give you a code that you can actually look up and see exactly what may be causing the issue in this case. So let's go ahead and jump in. Quick BIOS overview over here. We're actually right now in the easy mode of this particular BIOS here. Most motherboards actually have counterpart systems like that between easy mode and advanced. You can actually see the option up here, or the little short key, hotkey to actually click to bounce between both of them pretty easily enough. In easy mode, we actually do have on the top the current CPU speed, DDR5 speed in this case, CPU temperature, motherboard temperature, voltage, your kind of BIOS mode, and other little details there: full name of the motherboard, full name of the CPU, the amount of memory you have, and the current BIOS build date, which actually dates from October of 2022. I'm going to probably guess there's a new firmware out there, maybe very late 2022 or so. I'm not sure if there's something actually probably new, unless it's in a beta version. I definitely don't want to be installing one of those at this time. Over here you do have some options for game boost and overclocking, basically built in. If your memory does have an XMP profile, and many higher tier class memory chips actually do, you can go ahead and select those over here. If it's got more than one, it actually does have those numbers here. And over here you can even actually go ahead and set up some customized ones for yourself as well. Just to the right of that, we actually do have a list of devices here for boot priority. You can actually go ahead and move these around. So you can go ahead and select your preferred boot devices. Right now we actually do have a little SSD, a regular SATA SSD drive that's actually connected and does have a previous installation of Windows. So you can actually see that's actually set up as priority. You can always move that around and set something else as priority just by going ahead and moving these little icons around. Just below that, you actually do have the option here to see some full details of each particular device, or in this case, some other options in the motherboard. Here we have CPU. You can actually see the full frequency of the CPU running at the stock 4.7 gigahertz, which is pretty amazing. The base clock over here, core number, and hyper-threading technology. Core performance boost here is currently not available, and some other little options here regarding the CPU. Go ahead and click on memory to actually look at the pretty much the same details over here with the memory. We're in at 4800 megahertz. You actually do see here that we have two chips here. It does give you the name. This is Crucial Technology memory chips, both of them at 8 gigabytes, and you actually do see that the other two DIMM slots are currently empty. Just below, I already mentioned the XMP profile, and you can actually see here the DDR5 4800 megahertz that's available as a profile. Moving on to the next button, we actually do have this storage option here, which actually just lets us know all the devices that are basically hard drives and whatnot connected to the SATA ports, or the M2 slots, NVMe drives, etc., right there. You can actually see here there's only one drive connected right now. It's just a SATA drive, just a Samsung A50 Pro, good old 256 gigabyte SATA drive right there. Moving along here, we actually do see some options for fans. You actually do see the current fan speed and a couple of little options here for fan speed versus CPU and motherboard temperature, and other little temperatures here. These can absolutely be customized, but I actually do recommend using the hardware monitor, which I'll actually get to here in just a moment. Your options there, and obviously the visibility of all the numbers there are actually much better. Over here, we do have a help button. We can actually go ahead and click on these F hotkeys over here to actually immediately jump into all these options here. So just something to take a look at every now and then. On the bottom, we do have this little M flash button. I'm not going to click on it right now because if you do, it will actually go ahead and initiate the BIOS firmware utility, and they'll actually ask you if you want to go ahead and enter it and reboot the computer. So at this point, I'm not going to be entering that at this moment. Under favorites, we actually do have the option to go ahead and set some hotkeys for favorite sections in the motherboard. If there's more particular area that you actually go to and visit quite often, it might not be such a bad idea to actually set up a hotkey so you can immediately navigate immediately right to it. And down here, as I mentioned earlier, here's a hardware monitor, which does allow us to go ahead and view all the current CPU and associated case temperatures as well too, including board temperature. And you also do have the option to go ahead and manipulate the fan speeds versus temperature here. You can even go ahead and manually change each one. I'm going to actually go ahead and increase this, and just you'll immediately see the RPM on this fan is already starting to move up. CPU is actually set automatically, but feel free to go ahead and change thresholds here. If you actually go ahead and want to actually change those curves when the CPU hits a certain temperature, the percentage of CPU fan speed will actually kick in. So you can feel free to go ahead and manipulate those numbers here. Very useful tool right here. Probably one of my favorite sections in any MSI motherboard. Down here, we do have some additional options here that you can actually go ahead and toggle FTPM, debug control for LED control here. Actually go ahead and control those RGB LED controls down here as well too. Just basically a simple click, toggles them on and on. Sometimes I actually do see audio controller down here. I'm actually not actually seeing it here. This one actually go ahead and controls basically the little LED display on the motherboard itself. So you actually can go ahead and disable that completely if you find it, if you prefer to actually have it off. And some other options down here as well too. Very easy to use, even though you can go ahead and manipulate these in another section. Before it escapes me, up here on the top, just next to the advanced button, you actually do have an option to hit F12 to actually go ahead and take a screenshot. If you actually do that, it will actually ask you and go ahead and save a picture, a screenshot on a USB thumb drive. Since there's none installed or connected right now, you actually do see that error message there that there's no thumb drive available. Some other options here as well too, to go ahead and change the language, or to even actually go ahead and search a particular option inside the motherboard. So very useful options up here. Besides actually going ahead and change the date and time, you actually do have those options up here as well too. That's pretty much it for basically the easy mode here in the motherboard. I'm actually going to go ahead and switch over to the advanced mode, just clicking on the F7 key. And now we have all these options here. Now on the top portion, you can actually see nothing's pretty much changed. It's just all the options down here on the bottom. Really nice blue looking color here. It kind of matches the box this motherboard came in. So let's go ahead and continue here. Click on settings, do a quick overview. You actually do have some options here regarding the motherboard itself, basically system date and time, other advanced, some other options down here as well too. And if you actually click on this one right here for integrated devices, you do have the option to go ahead and enable and disable stuff, basically just like the onboard Wi-Fi, which I went ahead and disabled. Some other options here as well too, to toggle SATA hot plug options as well. Looks like we do have an option here for graphics configuration, depending if you're using a CPU that actually has onboard graphics. You can actually go ahead and change the preferred device here. IGD is basically your integrated graphics device as opposed to PCI Express. Some other options here as well too. We do have an option here regarding AMD overclocking. I'm not going to jump into that right now, but just bear in mind any sort of overclocking you actually do on the motherboard, feel free to actually make those changes if you absolutely do know what you're doing. Don't just go ahead and jump in and change a voltage or even like speed without actually considering the consequences. You could unfortunately damage your motherboard and related hardware as well too. Moving along here, we have some other options under the OC button for overclocking. As I mentioned, just be very careful making any changes here. Some simple changes you can immediately see and actually do here is you do have the option to go ahead and enable XMP profile, and if you do that, you'll have the option to go ahead and choose a profile. You can also manually go ahead and change the frequency of your memory if it's currently running at a slower speed and it actually is meant to run at a faster speed. In this case, this memory is actually meant to run at 4800, so I'll just leave it the way it is. Usually it's actually picked up pretty much automatically, but if you feel like it's running at a slower speed when it shouldn't be, feel free to go ahead and change that. Some other options here as well too. One option that I like immediately jumping to into CPU configuration is just temporarily, just for this demonstration purpose on this video here, I actually disabled Precision Boost Overdrive, which basically this and this option here for core performance boost pushes the CPU to a faster speed temporarily, I believe on a single core basis, and I actually went ahead and disabled that since occasionally the CPU core temperature begins to hover around 60 degrees Celsius when even just being in the BIOS right over here. As you can see here, I did actually install a stock cooler on this motherboard for just demonstration purposes. At this point, obviously I don't recommend using a stock cooler if you're going to be gaming or doing any sort of editing and whatnot. Your CPU would get quite toasty, and that's no bueno for just generally speaking any sort of electronic. So again, just be really careful manipulating any settings here. You obviously do see some options for voltage, much more thorough options for overclocking both CPU and memory, and you definitely don't want to trigger something that could damage something by accident. Just below, we do have the option yet again for M-Flash, which basically is the BIOS firmware flash utility. So just go ahead and there, if you actually want to go ahead and you can actually see here, it's asking me to reboot. I'm going to click no for the time being, but just go ahead and there if you want to go ahead and update your BIOS to a future firmware that MSI has actually released. Definitely not a bad idea to go ahead and do that, as usually I've seen firmware really improves the capability of the motherboard and especially post times as well too. Under OC profile, if you actually went ahead and make some changes in overclocking over here, you can actually go ahead and save those settings and create a customized profile over here. Feel free to even go ahead and export it to a USB, as you can actually see here. Very easy to migrate from one board to another, especially if you're going to be setting up the same settings across multiple motherboards, same motherboards you have actually over here. Hardware monitors, same little option we've seen before. You can actually go ahead and manipulate everything here. It's basically the same utility, just under the advanced section. And finally, down here we have Beta Runner, which actually gives you some, just beta testing options here, basically such as SSD self-test for NVMe drives. And I actually did see some other options here previously on other motherboards, which I don't see anymore. So maybe they were just actually used on a temporary basis and then removed. Anyway, that's it for basically a quick BIOS overview of the entire motherboard over here. And, hopefully everyone found that quite useful here. I would actually go ahead and flash the motherboard here, but I actually did not really see really a new firmware at this time. I just see a beta one, so I decided not to actually go ahead and flash this motherboard with it. But if just bear in mind, if you do flash the motherboard to a beta, not fully released BIOS firmware, just take caution. It is obviously just still in testing, so I probably would recommend waiting for a official release, unless of course it resolves an issue that you're currently facing using this board. Went ahead and just skipped the entire installation of Windows 11 here in this case, but I actually just want to go ahead and just demonstrate, obviously it booting up, and just open up Task Manager. So we can actually see some details here. Actually, not too much. Task Manager only tells you so much. I actually do see the 6-core 7600X CPU I actually have here working on this motherboard. Now, it doesn't really actually give me any more details here, and obviously I didn't install any drivers, so you don't see any video card appearing here or anything else appearing as well too. But actually, even the network components like Wi-Fi and LAN are actually not appearing here as well. But working pretty well so far, and the computer itself is actually pretty quiet. I'll just demonstrate that to you in just a moment. Even during the boot process and whatnot, I didn't actually hear any crazy fan speeds or whatnot other than just the initial one from the video card. So pretty solid build so far. Really enjoyed going ahead and having a build on this motherboard. I'm probably going to keep an eye on this motherboard, but as I mentioned earlier in the video, this is a whopping $400 plus motherboard as well too, and it's probably the priciest I've actually seen an MSI motherboard, unless it's basically part of the Meg or the Godlike class, which definitely run higher, much higher actually in price when it comes to basically MSI's point of view on the new B650 and X670 motherboards. So I'm actually just rebooting the motherboard and the whole system right now. You can actually see the little BIOS code up there is actually changing a little bit, just basically reflecting the entire post process. Actually, I do see a couple of little RGB lights. I do see there's some RGB lights down up on the rear part of the motherboard right over here, which is actually really nice. But as with another motherboard I actually did a review on, I actually don't see any other options or any other RGB colors around the motherboard, which is a little disappointing. I'm actually more used to seeing some over here and maybe even on the bottom, usually on the carbon class motherboards. But obviously you do have all those RGB connections, 3 and 4 pin, to go ahead and connect some lights there. I do know there are some people that obviously prefer not to have the lights on the motherboard and just have it elsewhere. So definitely an option there. Very cool to actually have the tracking actually be lit up, which is really a nice touch over here. You can actually see now that the computer is actually booted up. The CPU is running at around 51 degrees Celsius, even increasing. And obviously, again, just another reason not to use stock coolers. I'm just using it for these purposes here. You can immediately see the CPU cooler fan RPM has actually gone up since booting up. Pretty quiet motherboard. A little bit of a rev, depending on what video card you're using. The fans probably just jump up to full speed and then just shut right back down during the initial boot, as you probably saw very shortly during the initial boot of this computer. So overall, very good experience so far using this board. Not many boards actually have this little LED, basically right over there. So it's actually pretty useful to see. Though right now, really, the only thing it really does is just tell you the CPU temperature. So it is what it is. Anyway, I hope everyone enjoyed this video. Definitely shoot a like and subscribe. Support the channel, and definitely look out for some more reviews, particularly motherboard reviews and other hardware reviews that I happen to come across, as well too. Thanks again for watching, everyone. And as always, stay safe. Take care.